Yeah, so just want to say a couple words about who you all will be hearing from. So Dylan, we're incredibly lucky to have you, and thank you for volunteering your time to do this. Dylan has tons of experience in all different styles of debate. He was a very successful college policy debater, made deep runs at a variety of tournaments, qualified to the national debate tournament, which is the most prestigious college policy tournament. And since then, he has coached a variety of different high school debate events, including in Taiwan. He's currently debate coach at the Asian Debate League, which is kind of Taiwan-based organization that coordinates debate competition participation for debaters in Taiwan who want to compete in the United States. And Dylan has coached a variety of debaters from Taiwan, including to win national competitions in the United States. So we are incredibly lucky to be hearing from him, and I will turn it over to Dylan to tell us all about how we can make our crossfires really good. Thanks so much, Dylan.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here. So I wanted to talk about Crossfire and kind of its utility and some of the differences between Crossfire and maybe some of the other kind of questioning-based speeches that you've had in some other kind of models of debates. And so we're going to go through kind of the structure of Crossfire, what it's about. We're going to talk about some tips and tricks for asking questions, answering questions, and kind of some big things to avoid. So let me see if I can share the presentation here. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Anthony, can you all see this?
I cannot. I think I might need to make you a host. Sorry, 1 second.
I can see it.
Oh, you can see it?
Yeah.
Oh.
But I see it like as you're in PowerPoint to edit it.
Let's see. Hold on.
We can't get it to work. Anthony is really good at sharing the screen and then being your slide advancer. So we had to, hey, there we go.
Okay, does that work?
Can we get some reactions from the participants, thumbs up or something, if you can see PowerPoint? Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, we can see it.
Thank you.
All right, cool. It looks like we got a lot of thumbs up then. All right, so yeah, Crossfire, what is it? So the structure of Crossfire is it's a 3-minute speech. It's after each constructive, rebuttal, and summary in public forum debate. It's a questioning period, so both sides are asking each other questions. It's not really based in trying to kind of give a speech or give arguments. It's based on kind of referencing and understanding deeper the arguments that have already been introduced into the debate. This is a time where both teams share this 3 minutes to ask questions, and it's about direct interaction with the other team. So we're going to talk about some of these deeper. So the first one that I wanted to kind of emphasize is that both teams are sharing time to ask questions. So this is kind of really the main difference between Crossfire and maybe cross-examination that you have done before. And so both teams are kind of splitting this 3 minutes and asking questions. And so we're going to talk about some of the common pitfalls and some of the ways to use this to your advantage in a second. The next thing that's really important about Crossfire is this is the only time where you have direct interaction with the other team. So this is kind of critical. So when most judges go into watching a debate, if they had never before, their imagining of debate is very similar to how kind of Crossfire works. It's both debaters or multiple debaters talking at the same time and trying to parse out different answers to different questions and be able to kind of have this direct engagement with each other. It's like more of a conversation compared to what we normally do in our speeches, which is stand up. We get a section of 4 minutes or 3 minutes to talk about whatever we want with no interruption. So this is Crossfire is kind of emblematic of exactly what what people are imagining with debate. And so that's why it's really important to impress your judge in these moments. You can create a really good separation between you and your opponents in Crossfire because it really highlights your cleverness as well as a bunch of different ways to add and impress for your judge. And then because you're kind of contrasting and comparing yourself with your opponent directly there, it also, if it goes poorly and you're not prepared for it, it could set a really bad tone for the rest of the debate. So Crossfire kind of like sets the stage for how the judge is going to think about your arguments. And so we're going to figure out how to kind of make that work in advantage for you. So the similarities and differences. So it's similar in many ways. We're going to kind of talk about some of the goals. And the goals of Crossfire are a little bit similar to what you would be doing in cross-examination, but really kind of differ in that you're splitting this time. So it makes a lot of changes to what you can do and how you can do it. So since we're talking about splitting time between each other, you lose kind of the control of cross-examination. So when you're getting 3 minutes to just ask someone questions, you get to kind of guide the way that the question period goes, and you get to kind of dictate everything that's said in the entire speech. But since you're splitting time, you don't really have the same level of control in Crossfire. So you have to make sure that you're respecting your opponents, allowing them to ask questions, and allowing them to kind of be able to fill in some of the gaps and be able to have time to respond, even though you're kind of pressed for time. So cross-examination has a clear hierarchy. So cross-examination is when one person's asking a question and one person's answering. And so the questioner is always in control and the speaker is kind of following the tone that's set by the questioner. And you get more freedom to ask and set up questions and leading questions, and you can navigate a little bit more complex ideas. But Crossfire itself in public forum debate, since you're splitting this time, is kind of boundless. So it has a really big potential to drive your judges crazy and drive the debaters crazy if everyone's kind of not really listening to each other and not really respecting each other and not allowing these questions to get out. So it can be really dangerous for you to kind of avoid this structure. And so we're going to talk about some of the norms and the benefits of Crossfire and the way to apply it. The lack of the hierarchy between the questioner and the answer means that you're going to have to enforce those rules on yourself. So it requires a little bit of discipline and paying attention to how it's going and kind of the main ways that you're going to parse out these ideas. I also mentioned that in cross-examination, since you can ask like setup and leading questions, it makes it so you can navigate a little bit more complex ideas. In Crossfire, that's a little bit different. So you want to kind of simplify the ideas that you're kind of getting out of Crossfire because you only get maybe one question and maybe a follow-up if you're lucky before your opponent asks another question for you. So it's really important to simplify the concepts and kind of have goals that are accessible with 1 or 2 questions instead of having setup and leading questions. So we're going to talk about the questioning period first and asking questions, and then we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can answer. So the first kind of way that you can approach Crossfire is clarification. So clarification, we can, if we don't understand something that our opponents are saying, or if we maybe want the judge to hear something again, or they kind of like mumbled or we missed it, it could be a number of reasons, and we just need to ask them to kind of repeat something that they said or explain it in a different way. That's always okay, and that's kind of one of the main things that people use Crossfire for, but it's something that we shouldn't really focus entirely on because it's not really getting us anything new. But you always want to make sure that you know what your opponents are talking about. So it's really important that if you don't understand something, you figure it out, and Crossfire is kind of one way that you can do that. You could also use this clarification to help set up some of your answers. So if you think that someone has explained something in kind of a confusing way and you have a really good rebuttal to it, you can kind of guide them into answering or explaining their argument in a different way in order to have make your rebuttal sound a little bit better or more responsive. The next thing we can do to ask, or when we're asking questions, is to challenge the credibility of our opponent and of our opponent's arguments. So there's two main ways that we can do this. So first is we can kind of target their source. So we can show them, show the judge how they're missing key qualifications. They maybe are using faulty data, or their source is like being misinterpreted or otherwise not credible. So some things that you could ask are maybe about like where the evidence is coming from. You could ask about the author itself and who wrote the evidence, and ask what their qualifications are if you know that they have maybe some faulty credibility. You could also poke holes in kind of the beliefs that they have, and so maybe you can find some contradictions in this author's evidence, and that could help you kind of undermine the credibility of their source. So why should we not really pay attention to what their author is talking about? The second way is to undermine the credibility of your opponents. So the more that they fumble and the more that it sounds difficult to answer kind of easy questions or questions that maybe in the judge's mind seem critical, the less the judge is going to trust the other team. So if you can kind of catch them off guard with some good questions that they aren't really prepared to answer, in the judge's mind, it's going to kind of signal to them that they're not really understanding what they're talking about. So the judge is going to be distrusting of the kind of ideas that they have in the future, or of this particular idea that you're asking questions about. And so it's going to give you a leg up on being able to win the debate. So it's really, really kind of helpful to show maybe that you know something that the opponents don't, and that'll give you some kind of bonus points in the eyes of the judge. So I've seen a bunch of debates where this has kind of happened. So Anthony mentioned the national debate tournament, and one of the kind of most devastating cross examinations that I had seen was where these two teams were asking each other questions, and this team from Wake Forest started asking kind of some basic rudimentary questions about the ideas that this other team had in some of their evidence. And when they weren't able to answer it, it's basically like they lost all credibility in the eyes of the judge and everyone watching. And so it became very apparent who was going to win the debate. And so Crossfire, like I said earlier, can kind of signal what's going to happen for the rest of the debate. And so it's really important that you ask really good questions, and the better questions you ask, the higher likelihood you're going to have of being able to kind of come out on top in your debates. The next way that we can use Crossfire and asking questions is we can use it to undermine the logic of our opponents. So we can point out some inconsistencies or some of the kind of sillier claims that people make. So if someone says something totally outlandish, something that doesn't really make sense at all, you can kind of try and force them to explain it. And the judge will recognize this inconsistency or this kind of silliness of their arguments. And that would help you, it makes your rebuttals a lot easier because if the judge understands that their argument is ridiculous, then they're obviously going to buy when you say that in the rebuttal or in the future summary speeches that you have undermined the logic of their argument. The goal really here is to kind of instill doubt into what your opponents are saying and have your judge begin to think about the arguments the way that you want them to think. So I think Anthony and Chenna are going to talk about the topic and kind of some ideas about some fundamental beliefs from the pro and the con side. And so the more that you can get your judge to thinking about the same type of beliefs that your side wants them to, the easier it is for you to win a lot of your arguments. So if they buy into the idea that certain democratic values are really important or certain things are really true about social media, then you're going to be in a really good spot in the future speeches because you have less persuasion that you have to do. So Crossfire can help undermine their logic and set up some of your key arguments. You can kind of also use this undermining their logic to display a lot of your knowledge. So the more you ask questions and the more your questions are kind of working for you, the smarter you're going to seem, and that therefore the judge is going to think you're more credible. So this is kind of the opposite of undermining your opponent's credibility. You're establishing your own credibility as a speaker, as a really smart student, and as someone the judge is going to want to vote for. And so that's going to really benefit you and be able to kind of establish you as someone that the judge should trust with their arguments. And then also you can dive deeper onto previous examples. So we're going to talk about the use of examples in a second, but we can parse out some of the kind of information and examples that have happened in the previous speeches and be able to have the judge kind of understand what you're talking about. And then lastly, you can display your knowledge. So you're able to kind of drive home your main points. The more you're referencing key evidence or key ideas, the more the judge is going to want to listen to you and to believe in what you're talking about. Okay, and now answering questions. So since Crossfire is this shared time where you're both asking and answering, both of these are really, really important. So you need to not only prepare for the questioning side of it, but you also need to be really prepared for answering. And so we kind of have some tips here on how to answer and kind of the benefits of answering questions well. So first is establishing your credibility. So when your opponents are trying to undermine, your author or your ideas or your ability to speak on this topic, you're going to have to kind of fight against this. So knowing your evidence and your arguments is really, really important to doing this. So your level of familiarity with what you're talking about, the more you know about your contentions, it's going to come through when you're answering Crossfire questions. So it's important to kind of really study what you're talking about and be able to explain it really simply and really quickly. The more you're able to reference your evidence or your speeches without having to go back and scroll through your speech or pull up something that you said before, the more the judge is going to trust that what you're saying is true, something that you believe in, and is a good idea. Because if it seems like you have to fumble and you have to search for the answers, it doesn't seem as legitimate. It doesn't seem as real that what you're saying could be what the judge should vote for. You also don't always have to agree with their logic. So sometimes your opponents are going to try and set you up for traps. So they might phrase their question in creative ways to get you to make mistakes and say something that you otherwise wouldn't normally believe or say on your side. They might get you to think about and frame their question in a way that gets the judge thinking what their side is saying is true. So it's okay to say that you disagree with something on the premise of their question. So maybe they're asking you something that's based in something totally illogical. And you can kind of challenge that and say, well, we disagree with the idea of your question. And so then you can explain that disagreement there. You should pay attention to the phrasing and try and see if you can figure out the intentions of what the question is. So it's important to kind of take a step back and take a second to figure out what are they trying to ask you and what do they want you to say? What are they trying to gain out of asking you this particular question? And the more you can kind of pay attention to that and figure out what your opponents are saying, the better and more credible your answers are going to sound because you know what to avoid and what the goals of your opponent are. And you should also ensure that you're just not gifting them certain answers. So sometimes they might be trying to trick you. So it's important to kind of make sure that you're staying home and staying true to what you are there to be talking about. And then the next is, so you shouldn't always, or you should always sound confident no matter what. So even when you don't know, giving an answer that is your best guess and making it sound like it's not a guess is always better than saying nothing at all. So the more that you're pausing and kind of not really sure about yourself, it's going to signal to the judge that maybe your arguments shouldn't be believed. And so if you just immediately say something that may be questionably correct or maybe not exactly what you want to say or phrase a little bit incorrectly, you're still going to sound a lot more credible as a speaker and someone that the judge could believe in. And that's really critical in, just convincing or persuading the judge. So it's not really all about what you say, it's how much the judge likes what you say. And so the more confident you sound, the more beneficial that's going to be for you. The next is defending your logic. So backing up your answers with references to your previous speech is going to be really helpful here. So if you had a really good example in your first speech, you can use that example to help answer your questions. So that way the judge thinks about your example again, and they also get a really clear and concise way about how your answer works. So examples are going to really help tie down these complex ideas. And if the question seems irrelevant to the things you've said, you can always kind of sneak in some new and logical answers to what the question is about. So the more kind of open-ended questions your opponent asks, the more ability you have to kind of throw in some of your newer and smarter arguments that maybe you didn't include in your first speech because you were out of time. So you can use this answering period to kind of level or gain an edge on your opponent and use that as extra speaking time. The next one is being creative. So the best debaters use Crossfire to their advantage. So sometimes our questions don't go as planned, or our answers or what people are asking us don't go as planned. So it's important to be flexible. So you need to pay attention to the arguments that your opponents are trying to spin away from, and you need to be creative in your ability to talk about certain things. So don't feel too nervous to go off script and to kind of come up with your own ideas about what you can say and how to say it. Because like I said before, it's important that you sound confident and say things that seem reasonable to the judge. And then lastly, you want to use examples. So I've talked about this in a bunch of different spaces, but debates are really hard to understand and examples are always helping. So since we're talking about really complex ideas, usually in debates about democratic values and social media and all of these competing different arguments that you all are going to talk about, it's important to kind of simplify the debate and allow the judge to digest the arguments that you're talking about. And Crossfire is especially apparent for this. Since you only have 3 minutes of shared questioning time, it's really important that you kind of simplify your arguments and keep it concise while allowing the judge to understand. Because like we talked about earlier, Crossfire is about kind of first and foremost establishes clarification on these ideas. So the more examples that you use in your answers and the more simplified your answers become, the more the judge is going to trust what you're saying and be able to buy into the rest of your speeches. So Crossfire can really help set up kind of better speeches and better winning arguments for your final focuses and your summaries and your rebuttals. Okay, next we're going to talk about some things to avoid. So some judges really value Crossfire a lot, and some other ones don't really pay attention as much as they should. So some will pay very close attention. They'll write down everything that you're saying and use and reference Crossfire for the rest of the debate. And some will be really struggling to pay attention. They might be turned away by these common mistakes. And so we're going to talk about some of these strategies, and all of these strategies are designed to kind of make all these judges happy. And so we're going to talk about some of the benefits and the utilities of how these affect both kinds of judges, because you never know how your judge thinks about Crossfire. And so it's important to make sure that they're really paying attention and you can kind of rope them into your side by using these strategies or avoiding these kind of dangers. So the first is open-ended questions. So these are questions where you kind of allow them to say anything that they want. You're not really being direct about what you're trying to get them to say, and they can kind of spin it around and talk about anything possible. So this allows your opponents to sneak in extra explanations or new arguments that you maybe didn't want them to talk about. And so it allows them to get extra speech time to kind of build on some of their ideas. It also makes it a lot easier for them to dodge the point of the question. So if you really want them to say something and you ask them kind of an open-ended question that allows them to talk about anything, then they're probably not going to say what you want them to say because your opponents are going to be really smart and trying to avoid saying things that might hurt them. So they're going to talk about something that they know or use that time against you. It also helps to make your questions direct. So remember that you're splitting this 3 minutes of time between your opponent's questions and your questions themselves. So the kind of more direct their answers are, the shorter their answers are, the more time you're going to have to ask questions in the future. So it's going to help you in the long run if they aren't talking kind of for minutes at a time. You should have a strong idea of what your opponents are going to say in response. So the more direct your question is and the more focused it is, the more predictable your opponent's answer is going to be. And so that means that you can use Crossfire a little bit more strategically. So we talked about kind of the two kinds of judges and the way that they think about Crossfire. So judges who are paying close attention in these debates, they're going to be better served by direct questions because they're going to be really paying attention to the point of your question and kind of what your opponents say in response. And we'll be writing it down and being able to reference that back when you mention it in your summaries and your final focuses again to use it against your opponents. But then the judges who don't pay as close attention are more likely to tune out when you're asking these open-ended questions that allows for your opponents to kind of talk endlessly. Because those judges are going to get bored. They're going to, be kind of lose their focus in what's going on in the debate. And so we want to make sure that our judges are really paying attention and really honed in on what we're talking about. And so asking direct questions is a really good way to make sure that they're kind of locked into what we're talking about. And then, so we have long-winded questions. So this is questions where it takes you multiple sentences to kind of get at an idea. So you might be referencing a bunch of background information. A lot of people start to make a bunch of arguments in their question themselves, and then they'll say like, "Do you agree?" These long-winded questions are not ideal. So you should make your questions short and to the point. Everyone is fighting for time in Crossfire, and drawing out these questions makes everyone frustrated and kind of sets up a bad tone for the rest of the debate because your opponents are going to feel like you're wasting their time. The judge might think that you're wasting your opponent's time and kind of trying to be sneaky about it. So asking short and direct questions that are to the point are always better in the minds of everyone. Plus, when you're asking these long-winded questions that maybe you're referencing a bunch of different arguments, you're making a bunch of new arguments, or you're referencing a bunch of different evidence, it almost always guarantees confusion. So your judges or your opponents are going to lose track of what you're talking about, and they won't really be able to follow or answer correctly. So questions should be mostly one sentence, and on some occasions, it's okay to reference a little bit of background information, but you don't want it to be really too long or too focused on the background information. It should be all about the questions because everyone has listened to the same speeches. So they should all know kind of the background information that you're referencing because the question should be about the speeches. The longer the question's phrasing is, the more likely you are to lose your judge. So judges who are paying close attention will get wrapped up in the confusion, and it'll be harder for them to follow along with what you're talking about, what your goal is, what the premise of your question is, all of that. And then the judges who maybe aren't as big of fans of Crossfire will definitely not grasp anything because as soon as it becomes confusing, they'll be more likely to tune out. So the more simplified your questions are and the more focused they are, the easier it is for someone who maybe doesn't really pay a ton of attention to Crossfire is going to still digest your information. And if they're listening passively, they'll still be able to understand what you're saying and be able to kind of figure out your goal there. Then another kind of common pitfall of Crossfire is focusing only on clarification. So these are kind of the most frustrating in the eyes of everyone because it seems like we're wasting time where you're asking only, hey, what did you say here? Or what does this contention mean? Kind of for 3 minutes straight. And it gives your opponents free time to explain their arguments. And the judge might be as lost as you if your opponents are saying something really confusing. So you can maybe trust what you understood their argument as could be correct. And it also shows your judge that you weren't paying as close of attention as you should have. So I'm sure you all have heard this from Anthony and Shanna about how you're supposed to be flowing and taking notes and paying attention to everything that your opponents are saying. And so if you ask a bunch of questions about having them repeat their arguments or explain it in a different way, it might signal to your judge that you aren't credible as a debater because you're not paying attention to what's going on. So maybe they might think that your opponents might be more suited to win the debate just because they have paid more attention and they've kind of tried a little bit harder. And so focusing only on clarification could get you into some trouble. And judges that are paying a lot of attention are going to get really bored because you're asking them to clarify things that they've already said. So it seems kind of like a repeat of everything that they just said in their previous speech. And so they might not think that you're getting anything out of Crossfire, and so it can only hurt you. And then judges that aren't paying as or aren't enjoying Crossfire as much are going to kind of check out at this point, because you're not establishing anything new, and so they might not really pay attention to what's going on in the future of these crossfires. The next thing is about avoiding being rude. So public forum debate is all about public speaking and the perception of the judge. It was an activity that was actually made where the goal in mind was for anyone to be able to walk into any public forum debate across the world and be able to judge and be a reasonable judge. So basically, the regular people who haven't done any debate should be able to understand what's going on. And a lot of people really dislike when people are treating each other poorly. And it comes off not in your favor usually. And so it'll hurt your standing and make you come off a little bit unlikable. And so Crossfire is the easiest place for this to happen. So it's really important to pay attention to how you're phrasing things and how you're talking in Crossfire to avoid kind of being rude and causing these extra problems. So some ways that, or some reasons why this can happen in Crossfire is because you're directly interacting with your opponents. So it's the only time where you get kind of a back and forth where things could actually get come off as aggressive or angry. It's also because everyone has only 3 minutes. People can get easily frustrated if they feel like you're stalling, if they want to get to something that maybe you're not allowing them to. And everyone's trying to trick each other and ask questions and get a leg up. So it makes it really risky for everyone to kind of lose their cool. And so it's really important to avoid this and pay attention to this and always really sound polite. So you want to avoid coming off as short or disrespectful to what your opponents are saying. So some ways to kind of avoid this is treat all of your opponent's arguments and questions with respect. So you should always assume that their question is really, really good. You should talk to them in kind of a nice tone and answer it in a very polite manner, and treat all of their arguments as if they were the best possible version of what they're saying. And then it's important to ask your questions in a respectful manner. So make sure that you're not phrasing it in a way that you're kind of classifying them as being not smart. You want to make sure that you're coming off in a tone that sounds reasonable and polite. And you also, all of the things that we talked about before about open-ended questions and long-winded questions, those are all kind of ways that people could get frustrated about stalling. So making sure your questions are short, to the point, and direct, those are going to help you avoid kind of people being mad and thinking that you're stalling or avoiding letting them ask questions. And then lastly, we have breaking the structure. We really want to avoid breaking the structure of Crossfire. So remember, since we're sharing time, this is the easiest mistake when learning and starting up in public forum debate and in Crossfire to make. So Crossfire is all about taking turns and politely asking for follow-ups. So usually the norm is where the pro side asks the first question, and then the con side will ask the next question and kind of oscillates between those two. And then if you have a follow-up question, so if you ask something and then their answer doesn't really wholly respond to your question, or their answer is or your question was setting up a future question, you're usually allowed one follow-up question if it seems reasonable. So you should be kind of hesitant to deny someone a single follow-up question. But if someone does keep asking you questions, it's important to kind of make sure that you're able to say that it's your turn for the next question, and kind of assert yourself as able to ask questions. So don't allow your opponents to also break the structure and dominate your Crossfire. You should also seem really gracious when your opponents are allowing you to ask a question. So thank them, and that'll set up the stage for it becoming an easier and smooth functioning Crossfire. And this way, it ensures that everyone gets their questions in, and everyone's going to be really happy with how it's going and be in a good mood for the rest of the debate. And judges paying a lot of attention to Crossfire and like doing their due diligence are going to really love this, because it makes Crossfire run really smoothly, and the judges don't have to hop in to help and make sure that everyone's asking questions and make sure that there's no controversies or problems. And so there's going to be a lot more coming out of Crossfire the more structured your speech is going to be. And then the judges who aren't as invested in Crossfire will kind of start to you'll start to lose them once you break structure and once kind of everyone's talking out of turn and kind of saying, speaking over each other, especially in like online settings. It's really important that you wait for someone to finish, or you say, okay, that's good enough for your answer, in order to move on. And so that way people aren't kind of continuously speaking over each other. And then the next we have is preparing for Crossfire. So preparing for Crossfire before the debate, during the debate, and after the debate. All of these have really important roles to play in getting ready for Crossfire. So before the debate and before the debate tournament, you should have prepared common questions or questions to common arguments. So you should have set up, your best ideas and the ways that you're going to respond to certain things in Crossfire. You should have prepared answers to common arguments. And the reasons why we're preparing these, we should prepare these just like other speeches, because Crossfire itself is a really important part of the speech. So like I said before, it's the only time where the judges see direct interaction and exactly how they imagine debate to be. So this is going to be really, really critical for you. And the more prepared you are, the better suited you're going to be to sounding really effective and sounding really strong in Crossfire. Ways that you can prepare before tournaments is practicing with your teammates. So you can do things that are called extended crossfires, where where your teammates come up with a list of questions to ask you, and even go beyond the 3 minutes and ask as many questions as possible. So you get in the habit of answering the questions and asking questions, and multiple people should ask, or you should ask multiple people the same question. To kind of be prepared for maybe different responses that you hadn't thought of. So, multiple people kind of allows you to come up with a bunch of different ideas. And so you can brainstorm new questions or new answers to ideas and all work together to do that. You can also practice answering questions that you don't know. So we'll have kind of an activity later, or Anthony can talk to you about how to come up with different sneaky ways to avoid answering questions that you don't know in a second. And then the next one we have is during the debate. So when we're preparing for our speeches, in rebuttals or summaries or final focuses, we're kind of writing out some of our ideas, we're taking prep time. All of those things are also true of Crossfire. So you want to make sure that you're knowing what you're going to ask heading into the speech. You want to write down questions so that way you're not forgetting them and you're making sure that your questions are phrased directly and short and to the point. And so one of the things that I like to do is, as I'm flowing my opponent's speech and writing down their arguments, underneath the arguments that I want to ask about, that's where I'll write my question. So that way I can reference it on the same sheet of paper. And the judge is going to see that, I'm referencing different arguments. They're going to see that I'm looking at my flow. So it's going to make you seem like really engaged in the debate. So that'll help you out a lot. You should also talk to your partners about the goals of your Crossfire. So if you think that your final focus is going to be about one argument, then and you think your opponents are going to go for another argument, you should maybe ask questions about those things in order to kind of get your judge thinking about these really critical arguments in the right way. And so remember, all of your speeches are building towards your final focus and establishing kind of the end of the debate. And so you want to make Crossfire work toward those end goals and not just be some like random thing where you're asking a bunch of questions to fill out the time. So what are your priorities? That's important. And then after the debate. So when sometimes people are going to ask questions that we're not really prepared for, or we don't really understand, and that's okay. And so do your best to get through that part. But after you leave the debate, you should write down those questions and be prepared to break those down with your coaches or with your teammates in order to come up with new answers and write out some answers to these questions in case you get asked them in the future. So you should always be giving redos of speeches, and Crossfire is another kind of quick way that you can give a redo and give some practice speeches by answering some questions and asking some questions that you felt like didn't really go as well as you wanted them to. So the more you practice answering these questions, the more it's going to come off as just kind of something that you intrinsically knew rather than something that you're reading off or something that you've prepared. So the more kind of like natural it sounds, the better. So practicing answering and giving these answers is going to be really helpful for making sure that what you're doing is effective and really kind of driving home the points of Crossfire. So I think now we're going to do some activity for practicing and utilizing some of these. Hold on one second.
I think we have a little bit of time for questions if people have those. So
Okay,
feel free to.
Yeah, it's just a very quick question. Before I heard some debaters and also coaches talk about established perceptual dominance. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you want to, that's kind of what I'm talking about with credibility here. So the more credible you sound and the more kind of it sounds like you know what you're talking about and have a strong grasp of what's going on in the debate and can guide the debate, the more the judge is going to trust what you're talking about. But there's kind of a fine line there because the more you want to sound like you're in charge and you know what's going on, but you don't want to come off as rude or aggressive. And so it's important to kind of like walk a fine line of being able to balance controlling where the crossfire is going while also coming across as respectful to your opponents and being able to kind of get to the main points. And so it's a balance, but the more that you kind of practice asking these questions, the easier it's going to come across as you're speaking as an authoritative person on this particular argument.
Okay, and then on that point, I also heard them say that, it's suggested that the debaters should face the audience rather than facing each other.
Yeah, that's actually something that I definitely should have talked about. So you want to, the way that you're positioning yourself is really important. So if you're staring at your opponents, then you're leaving the judge out of the conversation, right? All of your speeches are geared entirely towards the judge. And so they only matter as much as the judge pays attention to them, because your opponents don't decide whether or not you win or lose. Your judge does. And so you should always face your judge and look at your judge as you're answering. It's going to come off as kind of unnatural at first, but it really makes a lot of sense when you think about it as you're speaking for your judge. Your judge is your listener, not your opponents, and everything that you're presenting for is for your judge. And so if you like face your opponent, you're leaving your judge out, and also it becomes really hard to hear. Because you're not directing your voice towards the person who's actually supposed to be listening to what you're talking about. So that's a good question. Thank you.
If I can add on real quick to Dylan's about facing the judge, the other thing is you should really be using your face while you're asking or answering questions, your facial expressions to help build, if you're like, that argument doesn't really make sense. What do you mean? Or something like that, you can get a lot of credibility, or you can even persuade your judge with just your facial expressions in your question. But if you turn and the judge can only see maybe half your face, they're going to lose all of your facial expressions. You kind of want to think about it as being on stage in a play, where you want to face the audience, not necessarily face the person that you're talking to, which would be your opponent.
Do we have any other questions?
Yes. You said that when you're clarifying with your opponents, you should guide your opponents to clarify in favor of your side, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can give some examples of this.
Sure. So yeah, so some examples. So some of the ways that you can do this is you can kind of spend time phrasing your questions. So like kind of how I talked about, like key assumptions that are going to be a big part of this topic. So like some things that you can think about for the democratic values and social media topic is kind of what democratic values are the ones that we're prioritizing, what is a democratic value and which ones matter most. And so getting the judge to think about these kind of ideas in a more favorable way to you is going to really help out. So asking your questions and starting off with a fundamental premise and using that premise to kind of guide how they answer is going to make sure that your opponents say something that agrees with you while also maybe setting yourself up for some of your better arguments. So it's really kind of like the background information that you're using to ask your question, drawing on kind of something that benefits you, and then leveraging that for the kind of way that you're asking them to clarify.
Okay. And I have another question. You said that it's not advised to ask "Do you agree?" questions.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
Is there like any circumstances where it's okay or good to ask these questions?
Usually it's going to come across as kind of like it's like too leading, and oftentimes if your question is something that's really against what your opponents are wanting to say, then they're just going to say no, right? So it usually doesn't benefit you at all. Sometimes you can get them to some way. It's like if you think that they've said something that kind of disagrees with their fundamental premise, you can make them explain that again to kind of drive it home to the judge. So like if you think that they said something that benefits your side, then you can ask them to talk about it a little bit more. So that way the judge can kind of recognize this as well, and then reference it in your speech. But most of the time, the like, do you agree questions are really something that should be served better in your rebuttals or your summaries or your final focuses, because those are arguments that you're making rather than questions that you're asking. And so they're not really built on kind of having the opponent say something in their answer. It's really about the question that you're asking. So it should be in your speeches as an argument, not a question.
The
Okay.
other thing, real quick, Brian, to add to that for "do you agree" questions is usually you can take out the "do you agree" part and then just ask the question. And that will, like, do you agree that all death is bad? Right? Rather than saying, do you agree? You could just say, is all death bad? Depending on the topic. And that type of question will work better for you than saying, do you agree? Because your opponent may not see what you're trying to get them to admit to. So you'll trip them up into answering and falling into your trap that you're setting.
I want to make a quick global kind of point, which is true not just about all of this advice about the Crossfire, but about all of the advice that we're giving. In many cases, you can do well without following our advice when your opponent does not know what is happening. Like, can you roll into a debate and ask, do you agree with our argument? And your opponent will say yes. Sometimes that will happen, and sometimes that will work. But we are kind of stemming from the assumption that we're trying to provide advice that will be helpful at kind of the highest levels of debate, right? And so these "do you agree" questions, will they work in some more lower level debates? Sure, but they won't work in higher level debates. Whereas the kinds of questions we're trying to get you to ask will work no matter what level you're at. So that's kind of the way that I would think about it.
Okay, thank you.
What other questions? These are amazing questions. So what other questions do the students or the teachers have before we break up to do some activities?
And if time is up and one side is still in the middle of answering the question, can they, are they allowed to finish answering that question, or they have to stop right away?
Yeah, to a reasonable degree. So like you don't want to keep talking for another like 10 minutes, obviously. But you can have a couple sentences to finish the main idea, or if you don't really care if they've already answered kind of what you're saying, you can say, oh no, that's enough. We can move on. But if you still want them to kind of finish up what they're talking about, it's okay and generally accepted for them to talk for another couple sentences to finish up the idea. Just like speeches, if the time goes up, you can finish your sentence. We're usually pretty gracious about kind of finishing these ideas because we want to hear what the students have to say about these ideas.
Okay, thank you.
I'm even more lenient on letting students finish and go a little bit over time when English is the second language for everybody, because there is that time that has to happen for the translation, from when you hear the question to answering the question. So personally, when I do it, I'm always pretty lenient on giving them maybe an extra 10 seconds to answer or something like that.